Okay. All right, there we go. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Madry. I am ASMP's Chief Legal Officer and Head of National Content and Education. And we are very, very excited to have you here today. We have people in the room with us in Zoom, at the Zoom webinar. And remember, if you're at the Zoom webinar and you want to ask some questions, make some comments, use that Q&A box. That is the best way for us to figure out and make sure we don't miss anything that you have to say there at the bottom. And we are also live streaming to YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook and I think one or two other places today. So we have people coming from all over, which is good because we got a lot to talk about. So here we go. Remember, this is an opportunity for you to ask questions and to comment on some of the things that are happening in our world. I'm going to jump in with a few announcements and a few catch-up items that I think I'm really excited to tell you about. So the first is, let's share my screen here. You know, just last weekend, an event ended up in New York that we were certainly proud to be a part of, and it was the annual Photoville Festival. This is a program and an event that ASMP has been part of for many years. And this year, we were excited to have a container once again. And the theme that we chose this year was change in the urban and natural landscapes. And this was part of what our New York chapter was focused on in order to incorporate the work of ASMP members and the work of NANPA members, our newest partners, who are so much a part of what we do now. And so two of the judges for this juried exhibition were Joe and Marianne McDonald, NANPA luminaries, in addition to Chirina Chen and Gary Hirshhorn from ABC News. And Chirina is a curator. The Photoville exhibition ended last weekend. I hope you had a chance to see it because 27 amazing members from both ASMP and NANPA had their work exhibited for about 3 weeks up in Brooklyn. And so definitely wanted to give them a shout out and to say congratulations to all of them. Now, I'm going to start today by talking about a few things that come up a lot. And 3 members in the last few months have reached out to me on various issues. And I want to quickly give 5 or 6 minutes to each of these topics because these are important topics to discuss. One member, Brian Lima, sent me some information about some contracts that he as a music photographer was being asked to sign. And if you haven't had an opportunity, I definitely encourage you to go over to the ASMP site and you can read these articles that I'm referring to. Predatory contract clauses is the first one. And what we were talking about here is when photographers are asked to sign contracts or are asked to get involved in deals that just don't make sense. And one of the biggest reasons that they don't make sense is this idea of who owns the work that you create. You know, we often talk about work for hire clauses, right? And there are some cases and some industries where work for hire clauses totally make a lot of sense. Most of the time, however, they don't. And most of the time, they are a bare rights grab. You know, in one of these contracts that Brian sent over, there's a quote in there and it said, "The results and proceeds of contracts or services hereunder, including without limitation, all material composed, submitted, added, created, or interpolated by contractor shall be deemed a work made for hire specifically ordered by client." And look, the most important thing to understand here is that if you enter into agreements like this, if you enter into agreements that have work for hire clauses, it's not like you own your copyright and then you're transferring it to someone else. What a work for hire clause actually says is that you don't own your copyright at all. You never did. At the moment you press the shutter, your rights were owned. The rights to that image were owned by the person who you signed the work for a hire agreement with. And like I said, there are some situations, few situations, where that could make sense. But 8 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10, it doesn't. And I want you to be really careful when you see that type of language in contracts. Now, you see it all over the place, not only in the contracts that I'm talking about in that article, which were music-related contracts, but contracts for whatever you're doing. We see it in editorial work. We see it in the nature context, in magazine work, and in book work. Right? We see it on the commercial side, certainly in architecture and in assignment work and everything else. Some industries, it makes sense. So there are industries that almost require that you enter into a work for hire agreement. Now, we still don't like it, and we try to make change where we can make change. But it's important to note that you have to look at your industry and your area of photography and go from there. And I noticed some questions coming in on the Q&A box, and we are going to get to those. I'm super excited. So thank you for submitting those questions in the Q&A box. It is the best way for us to keep track of what's going on. If you have run into these type of predatory contracts or language like that, I want you to reach out. Feel free to send an email over to legal@asmp.org. Sometimes we can point you in the right direction. Sometimes we can provide some alternative language that you might be able to talk to your client about, see if they might change it. Sometimes clients will call us and ask, hey, how do I make contracts that are more fair for photographers? Because I've been getting a lot of pushback on one thing or another. Those are important questions to ask. One thing, and this is a question that came into the Q&A box, and I think is absolutely true, is that there are a ton of these work for hire type contracts when you look at real estate photography. And I think that real estate photography is something we're going to be spending a little bit of time on in the near future, specifically as it relates to not only contracts, but drones and other items and topics, because there are a lot of legal issues there. But you're right, that is one of those industries that is almost exclusively work made for hire. And it shouldn't be. There's no reason for it to be. The only times I can think of reasons where work made for hire makes a lot of sense is when you're dealing with very sensitive, very proprietary information. And sometimes you deal with this with tech companies. Sometimes you deal with this with energy companies, where literally anyone else having access to the images in any context could be incredibly detrimental. Outside of those very narrow circumstances, not a lot of time that works made for hire makes sense in a contract. The next contract, or the next thing I wanted to mention, is an article that we wrote, and this is a project that we have been working on now for a significant number of months, and that is related to insurance. ASMP member Barbara Alper, who Barbara brought this to our attention towards the end of last year even, and two things had happened that she wanted to make sure we knew about. One thing is that her insurance policy for her photo business was suddenly ended. And if you go through and you look at this article, and again, this is there on asmp.org, you can read it. The business owner's policy, she got a letter from the company, and it said, "We will not renew this policy when it expires. Your insurance will cease on the expiration date shown above." And so one of the first questions was, can they do that? Can insurance companies just unilaterally decide they're not going to renew you? Turns out that the company that Barbara was dealing with made a decision at the corporate level that they weren't going to be renewing anyone in her area because they had determined that the risk was too great or they didn't want to accept that risk. And so there were a wide range of people who were suddenly without insurance. But here's where the story gets a little different, a little more concerning. And that is when Barbara went to get new insurance, she was told by in an email that due to nudity on her website, there isn't an insurance carrier that will insure her, and that there's nothing that she can do. Now, Barbara Alper is an award-winning photographer, longtime ASMP member, and certainly her fine artwork is some of the best in the nation. Her website should have no bearing on her insurance coverage. So we've been following up on this, both with the insurance companies, trying to get to the bottom of can insurance companies do this? Can they say, well, we don't like something that's on your website, and so we are going to deny you coverage. Now, what I want to ask everyone here and everyone watching is, please, if you have run into this situation, let me know, because we are wanting to write a letter that will go out to insurance companies that let them know that that kind of content based restriction is not okay. That professional photographers and fine artists like Barbara should not be subject to this type of exclusionary policy. And I will tell you that we have hit roadblock after roadblock, which is not surprising. Companies are not eager to talk about these situations when they happen, but we have options, we have alternatives, and this is the type of stuff that ASMP does for its members. In the case of Brian, we go out and we try to work on creating better contracts, speaking to organizations that enter into those type of predatory contracts, and then seeing if we can get a resolution. In cases like Barbara, we try to see what's going on and get to the bottom of it if we can. If you have run into this, if you have run into this situation, please let us know. The more information we have, the more members we know that have been affected by this. And by the way, non-members, if you're a non-member watching today and you've run into this situation, please reach out. Again, you can always reach us at legal@asmp.org. I want to, please, I'd encourage you to go read this article, When Insurance Disappears and New Policies Are Denied. I think there's a lot of insight in there that talks about what to do in these types of situations and describes the situation that Barbara found herself in. And I know that that Barbara is here today, and Barbara, I'm going to click this button here that allows you to talk, and please chime in if you'd like to add anything to the brief presentation that I just gave.
Well, hi there, Tom. Thanks for inviting me and for openly discussing this issue. My main concern is that this is about discrimination and censorship on a very broad level, and whether the insurance industry has the right to be discriminating in this and censoring in this way. My concern also was that the broker that I was using was recommended through ASMP actually, and I'm not, and they were really not, as far as I could see, terribly interested in taking up the cause in any way, or in standing up to the insurance companies. One of the insurance companies was a large one that I know of, Hartford. The other two, I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but so anyway, the broker didn't seem to be interested in really dealing with them in a direct, strong fashion and taking a stand that was supportive of this, my cause, and in general of the photo industry. So that's
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. And you raise a really important point, and that is when Barbara brought this to us. That was one of the first times we had heard this with this particular broker in this particular situation, and it spurred us to take a closer look at all our insurance providers and people who we recommend to make sure that they are working on behalf of the photographer first. That is our goal. We should have more information on that here in the coming weeks and months. And Barbara, let me say, one, I appreciate you being a member, and I appreciate the work that you do and standing up and bringing this to our attention. And I know it's been a long process, but we're going to continue to try to get some resolution here for you. Okay.
Thank you. And one last thing, I was able to then go back to my old broker, State Farm, and they issued me a new policy. No questions. They never had questioned anything about my site or my work.
Yeah. And I think that I'm glad that you didn't just take that victory of getting insurance and let it go, and that you're standing up for this, because I agree. Since its inception, ASMP has fought against censorship in any form, and this is part of that. So we're going to continue to try to find a resolution. And thank you again, Barbara. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay. The third thing that I want to mention, the third member concern that I want to mention, and by the way, after we do some of these wrap ups here in the first 30, 40 minutes, we are going to jump into some advocacy talk for 15 or 20 minutes. And then the remainder of today will be AI related talk. If you have to leave, if you have to miss this part, and you're really looking forward to the AI related talk, I definitely encourage you to go check out our YouTube. In addition, you'll find this on the ASMP Academy and some other places shortly after it ends. So the third thing I wanted to mention was one last member concern, and it was about photo contest terms and why they matter. And you all may be familiar with a contest that I think is currently ongoing. It's called the Analog Sparks Awards. And one of our members brought it to our attention that there were some very concerning things that were in the language of this photo contest. And I will tell you that photo contests are something that we often see very expansive language in the terms and conditions. In many ways, many photo contests are just simply rights grabs. And we definitely want to fight against this. In the Analog Sparks terms and conditions, and I reference this in the article, it talks about you would be granting Analog Sparks an irrevocable, perpetual, unlimited, non-exclusive, royalty-free, transferable, infinitely sublicensable, worldwide license to use and exploit your content. And very importantly, and especially, you're reminded that you allow Analog Sparks to publicly publish, exploit, and promote your content, as well as permit third parties, including but not limited to press partners, marketing platforms, and affiliate websites, as decided by Analog Sparks, as well as Analog Sparks itself, to promote, publish, or exploit your content without any obligation or dues towards you or any third parties. And I don't know if you all have seen something quite as expansive as that. That was pretty broad. We have been trying to get in touch with the right people at Analog Sparks to talk about the concerns that we have here. And I appreciate Jeffrey bringing this to our attention. One thing, though, it made us do is think about all the different ways that contests can introduce clauses that are damaging to photographers. To that end, we've developed an initial draft of the ASMP model terms and conditions for photo and video contests. Now, this is still a work in progress, but I wanted to let you all see some of this as we continue to work on it. The way that we are going to do this is develop a set of foundational principles. Those things that we think every contest, no matter what it looks like, whether it's in the photo world or the video world, the creative world, the advertising world, that every contest should have some principles that they adhere to. And I wrote a few of them down here. You know, one, the entrant should at all times retain their copyright in the works that are submitted, and this copyright should not be divided, shared, granted, or otherwise apportioned to the organizer or the sponsor. Period. I can't think of a situation in which an entrant should be required or agree to transfer their copyright or split ownership or in any way lose any of their copyright rights. Now, they should be required to grant a license to the organizer or the sponsor. But entrants, number two, should be asked to convey as few rights and permissions as possible to meet the needs of the organizer or the sponsor. At a minimum, this includes limiting the use of entries for promotion related to the event or in support or description of the event. What do I mean by this? Look, I think what you should expect to see in contest rules are things like, I agree that my winning entry can be used to promote and be displayed with respect and in relation to the contest itself. It shouldn't be used as a piece of advertising totally without reference to the fact that this was a winning contest entry. It shouldn't be used in a way outside of the idea of using this to show who won the contest and talk about the great winning entries. And this is a subtle point, but it shouldn't be all the entries. It should be a subset of the entries. What we often see with photo contests is that the language is such, it allows the organizer to use all the entries, whether they win or not, for all these different purposes and all these different reasons. That is something that we are going to take an active stand against. And it starts with these model rules and foundational principles. Prizes, entry fees, and categories should be detailed and itemized in the official rules. And any monetization of sales of entries in any way should be done in conjunction with the entrant, and proper licenses and compensation should be negotiated. What is that referring to? Well, how many of y'all have seen contests where, they say, oh, you can be part of a book and then buy this book, that kind of thing. Except what we're really doing in those situations is monetizing the work in a different kind of way. And simply that goes above and beyond what we believe an entrant should be required to give up when they are entering a contest. There's a balance here because organizers have a role and responsibility to have a platform for these contests, and entrants have a responsibility to ensure that that their work is used in a way that they are aware of and know about. Well, that brings us to something very interesting, because today I am incredibly excited to announce a brand new contest from ASMP. This was partly came out of this discussion we were having with Jeffrey and looking at the landscape of contests, and after it spurred this idea of creating model terms and conditions. Some of you all may remember that a few months ago, there was an ad campaign with images by Alec Vianu, who did a series of images called ASMP Remembers. This is now an award-winning ad campaign. It was recently featured in the print edition of Lucer's Archive. And it was by the ad firm Ogilvy Health. Certainly Ogilvy one of the largest ad agencies in the world. These photo illustrations were by their senior VP of design, Alec Vianu. And so today we are very excited to introduce a new contest that has come out of this initial campaign, and that is ASMP Remembers Images of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Entries are open now. They opened about an hour ago, and they're going to stay open until July 10th. And there are the purpose of this contest is that there has not been something that affected the whole world in this way, and certainly any time recently. And so many creatives, so many photographers, videographers, so many people had their work affected by this, whether they suddenly had to find new avenues of work, or they were able to work on personal projects, or they were inspired by what they were seeing around them. And so this juried exhibition is designed to showcase the work that you made as a result of or in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's only one rule. The work needs to have been made from March 2020 or later, and it has to represent your response to this. Now, we are going to certainly put our money where our mouth is, both on the rights of the photographer. So we will be using the model rules that we've discussed, that I was just mentioning in relation to Jeffrey. But many of our wonderful sponsors have also come to the table for this contest. There's a prize pool worth over $10,000. We have $4,000 in cash prizes, $4,000 in equipment from our title sponsor, Sony, $2,000 of other prizes, including in our professional category. Wonderful Machine is building a custom client list or providing portfolio reviews for our student winners with Honor Brown from former New Yorker photo editor, or helping you design a digital promo design, again, from Wonderful Machine. Everyone will be getting a custom engraved award, but this is the first of many competitions that you're going to start seeing, which are part of a new program, the ASMP Awards. So throughout the year, we're going to have different contests, some of which are only open to members, meaning ASMP and NANPA members. Some of them are only open to everyone, like this contest is. But at the end of the year, the winners of all these contests will be invited to a live event, which will take place, the ASMP Awards annual event, which will be happening in early 2024. We're super excited about this. Who are the judges? Well, you might have heard of some of these names. Mark Seliger, one of the most legendary photographers currently shooting, former photo editor for Rolling Stone. He's won so many awards. I can't even list them all in his bio. Vanity Fair, Oscars photographer, one of the great living photographers today. Mark is going to be one of our judges. Lindsay Weatherspoon. Lindsay, in addition to being a Canon Explorer of Light, is an Atlanta-based photographer who is on ASMP's board of directors. Her work is incredible, and I encourage you to check out Lindsay's bio and her website. And our third judge is someone I just mentioned, Alec Vianu. Alec, as Senior VP of Design at Ogilvy Health, the creator of the campaign that I was mentioning earlier, he is our third judge. All the information you can find here at asmp.org/awards. You'll see more about this. Like I said, you can enter now in our brand new contest portal. We're very excited about it. Members, ASMP and NANPA members, always get 20% off the entry fees to this contest. And so while this is open to everyone, members are always going to get the best prices. The entry fees for students are $10. For non-professionals, it's $20. For professionals, it's $35. There's also series images and AI and photo illustration categories, which will be separated out for reasons that we're going to talk about. So we're very proud to introduce this. We definitely want to thank Sony. We definitely want to thank Wonderful Machine. This is going to be a pretty amazing event. We have a lot of stuff planned for the ASMP Awards in the coming year. The core of it, though, is photographer-focused rules, terms, and conditions, which are going to preserve the rights and the copyrights of the photographer. So definitely proud of that. Okay. Oh, this is the portal where you can submit the work if you. Oh well, I have logged in with this email too many times today, but you can go to the main page, asmp.org/awards, enter now, prizes, judges, a big FAQ down here with all the details you could want. And then terms and conditions, you can find all the details down there. So certainly happy to announce this. Very proud of it. We've been working on it for a while. All right. Now, let's talk about some advocacy work. And, you know, our advocacy work expands in kind of two directions. And the first direction I'm going to talk about is the judicial advocacy work. That's where ASMP goes into the courts. We write amicus briefs. Those are friend of the court briefs that help courts understand how their rulings affect photographers, affect photography. And most recently, a brief that we wrote and were a counsel of record on was the Supreme Court case, the Andy Warhol Foundation versus Lynn Goldsmith. Now, you can find so much of this on our website where we wrote about all these details. And on our YouTube channel, you can find live streams that we did of the oral arguments, because we've been involved in this case since its inception almost 5 years ago. And Lynn Goldsmith, in addition to being one of the most famous rock and roll photographers and music and portrait photographers in the world, has been an ASMP member for many years, and ASMP has supported her in this fight against the Andy Warhol Foundation. Her case went up to the US Supreme Court last fall. And just about a month ago, month and a half ago, we got the ruling that came out where the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, came out in favor of Lynn Goldsmith. We could not be more excited for that outcome. And we had, in that case, spent countless hours, written multiple briefs, both at the appellate court level and the Supreme Court level, and both alone and with other groups that we worked with, some of our compatriots at sister organizations. We're so proud of Lynn and this victory. You can find a lot more detail about this by going to our website. We're going to be doing some additional webinars on this if you want to really dig into the details. I'm only going to talk about it for a few minutes here. But judicial advocacy is one type of advocacy that we do. The other type of advocacy that we do, and I'm going to welcome to the stage now Sean Fitzgerald. Sean is a former past president of NANPA, ASMP member, photographer extraordinaire, and also does a ton of advocacy work for NANPA and for ASMP. The reason I'm inviting Sean out here for the remainder of today is for him to talk about a particular advocacy campaign that NANPA and ASMP have been intimately involved in, and Sean in particular has taken the lead on. It has to do with something called the Film Act. And so thank you, Sean, for joining us today, for hanging out backstage while I talked about 10 different things before we got to the meat of it. And Sean, maybe you can just take a few minutes here at the top and talk about what the Film Act is, why members should care, and what NANPA and ASMP have done in relation to it.
Okay. For anybody who's photographed on public lands administered by the Department of the Interior or Agriculture, which gets into national parks, BLM lands, national monuments, wilderness areas on the Department of Interior side, and then National Forest Service lands on the agricultural side. Whether you need a permit is determined by a 20-plus-year-old law that is problematic. It was passed in the time when a video shoot involved typically very large crews, big gear, had a lot of impact. And when there had been some abuses, so to speak, and that some big movies had filmed and didn't have to pay anything, and people didn't like that, and thus a permitting scheme was passed that really drew a distinction between still photography and video filming, quote unquote, and whether the use was commercial or not. So commercial filming, you required a permit. Still photography, you generally did not require a permit unless you needed certain things like special access or using models and that kind of thing. The problem was the world changed. Technology just destroyed the difference between film and video. Now, when you can do professional quality work with your, with a film camera that can flip back and forth, or even your iPhone or cellular phone, where you can move effortlessly back and forth between stills and 4 and 8K video, that distinction no longer has any relevance anymore. So that's become an area where we've had all kinds of abuses, and rangers and land managers may come up and question you, about what you're doing and whether you, look professional based on the gear you're using, and then question you on whether you are, trying to use what you're doing for commercial purposes. And the question of whether a use is commercial is also no longer hard to figure out today, especially in the world of social media and YouTube and kind of secondary both income and promotional sources, where what's the use? Is it truly commercial or not? And the third problem with this and trying to base a permitting scheme based on whether the use was commercial is oftentimes, for stock photographers, for many, you don't know whether there's ever be a commercial use. It's all very speculative. And that has created a situation today under the existing law where technically many people who work on public lands, whether that's nature photographers, conservation photographers, stock photographers, news gatherers, event and wedding photographers, etc., often don't know whether they are actually in compliance with the permit requirement, especially when they're shooting stills. And where the Parks Department, for example, can rather arbitrarily make decisions on whether to come after you based on whether your YouTube video has suddenly become more successful and is generating some income, and they decide they don't like that. And that's problematic. That raises a lot of uncertainty for our part as small business people. We need certainty. And it also raises legal questions with sort of an arbitrary application of the law. And that's a problem, especially because failure to get a permit, it can result in both civil penalties and potentially up to 6 months criminal penalties. And all of those raise all kinds of problems. The other triggering factor here for why we have an opportunity to change this law is that a few years ago, a district court in, I think it was New York, had a case come before it where a filmmaker did a small scale filming on a National Historic Site and ended up getting a ticket after the fact at the premiere from the Park Service. And the judge in that case took a look and said, there's really serious First Amendment problems with a permitting scheme based on whether it's commercial or not, and the First Amendment has, frowns on anything that puts a restraint on the expression of our First Amendment rights. And that court ruled in our favor and struck down the permitting scheme. So we went for over a year where that permitting scheme was in limbo, and the Park Service and other federal land managers instituted a scheme based on the impact. And that's ultimately where we believe all this needs to go. You need to require a permit only when there's an impact to the lands that's more than a typical visitor would have. Last year, a couple advocates in the Senate, especially Senator Barrasso from Wyoming, and on the Senate side, and then Congressman Fulcher from Idaho on the House side, introduced a film act that was based on creating a permitting scheme focused on impact and eliminating the commercial distinction. And yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. It's rather long and a little bit more, little bit longer than I would have wrote it, but there's a lot of concerns and a lot of back and forth that's been kind of going back in this thing. You know, the old adage that that lawmaking is like making sausage. It's kind of ugly business. You don't really want to look under the covers sometimes. And this is certainly one of those situations, as we're trying to accommodate a balance between photographers' rights, videographers' rights, versus the ability to protect valuable and precious lands and allow the land managers the ability to have reasonable controls. So it's a balance that we're trying to get to in this new legislation. And what they put together was something called the Film Act. It started off last year, and it's part of an overall much broader recreation package. I think it's the what was it called? The America's Outdoor Recreation Act of 2023 is so the Film Act is a small piece of a much broader piece of legislation, which allows us ideally to get it passed on a bipartisan basis without the opportunity for those who might oppose it to really take us out at the knees. So it's an opportunity to get this thing passed, and we've built the advocacy. The bad part of it was the decision in New York, Price versus Barr, which became Price versus Garland, and was appealed by the government. We lost that one. The government won, and the Supreme Court refused to take it. So it created a bit of a rush for us to try to push through a different permitting scheme. And where it is right now is that it is passed the Senate subcommittee, and they have listened to our concerns starting from a concentrated effort last summer through last fall, and then a huge effort this spring to raise a number of our concerns and to tighten this act up. And what we wanted to make sure that it did was add much more certainty as to when we need a permit. We wanted to really ensure that it was very clear that it was only impact based. We wanted to make sure that certain language which could have in the original version could have maybe been interpreted to believe that the Wilderness Act areas could create sort of their own scheme. We got that clarified that no, it really needs to be based on impact just as well on all federal lands. And we wanted to make sure that there were certain news gathering exemptions, make sure that was exempted from any of those types of requirements. And make sure that you did not need an extra permit if you were filming something that was already authorized or allowed, such as a wedding. So if for wedding and event photographers, folks who do that on public lands, the event may have a separate permit. The photographer would not need one. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that the possibility of criminal penalties was eliminated. This is just simply not a situation where we believe that's appropriate. And then finally, there was some, there's some vaguer language than we wanted, especially in the definition of what a film or still photography activity was. And, my belief was that it needed to make it clear that it needed to be a number of people operating in the same area at the same time under a similar project before you need a permit. And we have, on all those fronts, we've made progress, either getting our concerns implemented into the Senate side of the act, or most of our concerns in the language as the act has evolved in committee. The basic overall switch in the act would be to eliminate the focus on commercial use. It would focus on whether there's an impact, and it would lay out certain situations that are kind of familiar. If you need exclusive access for still or video photography, you need a permit. If you needed big gear out there, booms and, cranes and stuff like that, that are beyond your basic tripod type handheld and easily movable gear, you might need a permit. Need exclusive use if you'd bother others, et cetera. I mean, mostly reasonable constraints. And then beyond that, the permitting scheme is based on the number of people. So between 0 and 6 people, 0 and 5 people, you would not generally need a permit. And that the number of people in that filming or still photography activity would include the photographers, any assistants, any models, et cetera, that are on site working on that shoot. If you had 6 to 8 people, you would need an authorization, but that's just a notice, basically. It's not a permit. You just send in a notice, and they automatically essentially authorize the filming or still photography. And then third, if you had 9 or more people, you may be required to have a permit. And that, I think, is going to make it much, much easier for even, certainly small solo photographers and videographers, stock videographers. Many of their constraints are going to be, and concerns are going to be gone. Small documentary filmmakers, whether conservation photographers, conservation filmmakers and others, they're going to be able to operate without needing a permit in situations today where they do. And oftentimes they're working under very small budgets or working very speculatively. And we think that will really help, kind of open up a lot more folks to make very important work without having to work under a permitting constraints. And for folks who do events and weddings, we think it'll also be, a great assistance. And for press photographers, it really would clarify that, the protections that you have for the most part. There are issues in there. Some of the language is not as clear as we want. In some provisions, it's 90% of the way we want it to be there, et cetera. But at this point, the key thing is to get a new law in place that offers us most of what we need, and then we'll have a chance to monitor it in the rulemaking to kind of get our input into place, and then to monitor how it's applied after that, so that we can go back and modify the law. And these subcommittees are quite willing to continue to modify it. I think they understand the situation and our concerns and have been very responsive. So I think, let me think, where it's at right now is the Senate side has evolved a version, and that has gone through committee in the markup, and it's ready to be included in the Senate side of that package. The House side still needs work, but we believe that they'll adopt the Senate version, and then we hope to kind of make some additional improvements with it. That should happen probably in the next month. And then ideally, the overall package would get passed in sort of an omnibus sort of bill probably sometime later this year, and we would then have a new scheme. I don't think at this point we know whether we would need to activate all of our collective members to notify folks. We may be able to do this more quietly, which, so there's some issues like that we still have to work on, but I think it would be a huge improvement for almost all of us, and eliminate so much of the uncertainty that we are facing right now with those of us who work on public lands. So, Tom, do you have any other questions that I kind of work through?
Yeah, well, first, Sean, thank you for all the work that you've done, and I've been able to sit in on a number of these meetings and see the work that Sean has done in this regard. And some things that he just slipped in there are might be the subject of 5 different meetings back and forth. But some of these issues are big issues. Can you imagine having an image that you took You weren't intending for it to have a commercial output, but all of a sudden it did. And not only were you then chased down with the bill, but you were also possibly chased down for criminal penalties for not getting the right permits for all these different things. That's not okay, obviously. And what we find when we look at these types of things across government and across other situations is what groups like ASMP and NANPA are focused on here is providing clarity, right? Clarity to the members, clarity to the public at large, and clarity to the rangers and the people who are enforcing these rules. Many of us have had a situation where we've been told on the street, on a public street, to move on because our tripod looks too professional, or any of these types of situations, and that's not okay. And so part of what organizations like ours do is try to create a world in which photographers can go about their business both in their personal lives and in their professional lives, and be able to thrive and survive, and that's our goal. And so, Sean, thank you so much. I've noticed some comments coming in saying, "Hey, this is a game changer. This clarifies what I needed to know." Thank you, and I'll echo what many of our members have already told us related to the Film Act, which is they're happy to see the work done. Now, you and I have had some conversations about this. May be just this is one issue. The whole issue of permitting as a whole, when it comes to things like workshops and other ideas, these are things that may have to be tackled in other bills and other forums. But we're working on it, and we're aware of it. Like Sean said, we may need members to write their Congress people, let them know that they need to support this bill when it comes up for a vote. And so stay tuned, and you'll get emails from us if we do need to activate the membership in that way. And so, Sean, thank you for all the work you did. I'd love to have you stick around if you have a few more minutes as we start talking about some.
Let me add one thing too, and
Please.
that is that one of the things we're going to need to do with this act, and that we need to do a better job of generally, is to harvest the incidents, the real world anecdotal stories out there, because at the end of the day, all of these rules are enforced by people, and oftentimes these people, these rangers and others, have very difficult jobs, but that doesn't mean that they can start establishing a pattern where they apply these rules in ways that really hampers us, and is not, and especially in a kind of an arbitrary or unfair way. So what I would say, anytime, is to report these things into ASMP and to NANPA when you have incidents you run into that you find to be problematic. We need to know about those so that we can present those to Congress to help get these laws changed. And if the Film Act does get passed, there is going to be a new period of sort of uncertainty about how the federal agencies are going to interpret it and then apply it. We need to continue to keep pressure on them, and then to have a very clear vision of how they are applying it once they are taking the Film Act and applying it in the future. And so we will need to know how it is affecting you and what you're experiencing, and that'll help us keep a database of things. And then hopefully, if we need changes, we can get those rapidly, rather than just waiting again 20 years. It's taken us to get to the point where we can get these things changed now. So your experiences are very important, but we need to know about them. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. And again, you can always send anything like that, no matter what you're facing or encountering. You can always send that information to legal@asmp.org. That gets to the right place, so that we can follow up on this. And we do appreciate you sending in those experiences. Well, one thing that happens every year is all of the major trade associations get together. Now, in the last few years, we've done it virtually because of the pandemic. But last December, I headed up to Washington, D.C. to meet with our counterparts in other organizations, where we talked about what we're facing in the visual and creative industries of things that were coming up. And I will give a particular kudos to Rebecca Blake with the Graphic Artists Guild. At our December meeting, Rebecca and the Graphic Artists Guild has long been supportive of the work ASMP has done, both in the courts and elsewhere. But Rebecca sounded the alarm on AI and generative AI technologies, and wanted to really ensure that the rest of the organizations were focused on the things that were coming down the pike. And, you know, since that meeting in December, I think we've just seen literal exponential growth month over month when it comes to how generative AI platforms are affecting photographers, now videographers, graphic designers, creatives, writers. We do a lot of work with the Authors Guild, the National Writers Union, many others. There is almost no segment of the creative economy that has not had to currently wrestle with generative AI technologies and what that means for their particular industries. In the last few months, we've seen the major platforms, first starting with Midjourney and DALL-E, as image-based generative AI platforms leap into the world. We've seen iterations of them get smarter. We've seen lawsuits related to this. One of the big lawsuits that is occurring both in the UK and in the US is a lawsuit between Getty and Stable Diffusion, Stable AI, when it comes to whether works were improperly used for training purposes. And so today, I want to open up the conversation. And by the way, this is the first of many conversations that we're going to have about AI and what it means for you and what you need to be thinking about and what you need to be preparing for as we continue to step forward. We will be talking about a few things today. If you haven't seen some of these technologies at work, we'll do a super brief demo, and I will already preface the demo by saying I'm going to show you one picture with one little thing because I am not you all. I am no longer a professional photographer, and so I'm only going to show you something from my end of the world. And then we definitely want to hear the questions that you have about AI and the things that you would like to know from us. We already have some really great questions in the Q&A. As a reminder, if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom webinar. If you're watching this on one of our live stream channels, you can hop over to asmp.org under events, and you can come join us at the Zoom webinar and then put your question in if you would like us to address it. And we will try to address as many questions as we can. You know, there are a number of people who write me as the legal officer for ASMP, and they have a very anti-AI stand, and it goes something like, you know, what can we do to stop AI? And the answer in that sense is nothing. We can no longer stop AI from doing anything. The AI image, the generative AI platforms are only going to get better, and they're only going to increase how popular and widespread they are. But I get a number of other emails, and those emails talk about what are the ways that photographers in whatever industry, whatever field of photography they're in, can utilize AI features and AI platforms to enhance and support their businesses. And, you know, I think it's really important that that photographers take a reasoned approach to AI, because this is certainly, since I have been involved in professional photography, both on the photography side and now on the legal side, this is one of the most impactful and widest reaching developments that I've certainly ever seen. I think you will find people on all sides of the AI debates that speak in hyperbole, but I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that 12 months from now, the landscape of professional photography is going to look different because of generative AI technologies. You are going to have to approach clients in different ways. You're going to have to discuss things with your clients differently. You're going to have to convince your clients about certain things, about the skills that you bring to the table. Everyone gained a competitor as these platforms came online. And what they can do is nothing short of amazing. If you have not seen some of the videos and some of the demonstrations that are out there, I encourage you to go to YouTube and click on the search box and type in generative AI demos and see what can be done in mere seconds. It's mind-blowing. But I want to start this conversation today by talking about a program that one of our chapters did a few months ago. And now a few months ago in the landscape of AI is a lifetime, but the information that is in this video is pretty incredible. And it's incredible to me because the panel that was put together by Ben Coe and the Ohio Valley chapter, the panel was a number of photographers who are finding ways to incorporate AI technologies into their industries, into their businesses, into their workflows. And it was not a anti-AI look at this. It was a, hey, here are a whole new set of tools and features that we have. If you haven't had a chance to watch this video, I definitely encourage you to do so. You can go to YouTube and just type in ASMP, get to our channel. You can see it there. You can also always go to the ASMP Academy and see it there. But I definitely encourage you to watch this, not only for some of the video demonstrations that you see, but for the content itself. Additionally, let's see here. So, as OpenAI is probably the big dominant player when we talk about the different platforms. Their image generative AI image-based platform is DALL-E, and then of course we have Midjourney, and the most recent one that came to market was Adobe Firefly. And generative AI raises a number of questions. As you can see right here, based on what Adobe is using to market their product, it says, describe the image you want to generate, and then you click a button that says generate. And in many ways, that's what happens. Now, the output right now can be everything from stunningly incredible to that looks ridiculous, right? And there's a lot of that looks ridiculous that we see going on at the moment, but less and less every month as creators learn how to harness these platforms, and as the platforms themselves get smarter. So I want to continue by talking about some of the legal issues that arise here, because I think it's important that we all have the framework of what we're thinking about from an organizational perspective and what you all might be thinking about from an individual perspective. When we talk about AI, we're really talking about two major sets of legal issues. We have the issues related to copyright and infringement on the training side, on the ingestion side of these platforms, of these models. And then we have the issues with output. Now, those two sets of legal issues are separate and apart from the business issues that that photographers will face. You know, there are some areas of photography that are going to be uniquely affected, right? And some areas of photography that in many ways are insulated. Those areas of photography that require and have long had truth concerns about truth in the creation, about the authenticity of the content, and about, for example, NANPA and nature photography has long had truth in captioning ethical focus, ensuring that what we see in what we're told we're seeing was captured in the right way in ethical standards. But I think we're going to start seeing this kind of truth in captioning across the board as we start seeing more and more AI based works filter into the marketplace. So when we talk about the legal issues on ingestion, we talk about simply the fact that, for example, stable diffusion stability AI scraped, according to Getty, all of Getty's images that were on the web to help train the image, the image model, or the generative AI model. Now, how did Getty prove this? Well, the output from this, the works that were generated by the AI platform often had some garbled interpretation of Getty's watermark on them. Kind of not too hard to prove when that's what you're looking at. And while those cases are still in limbo, we've seen a number of other court cases that deal with that deal with the idea of who owns what and can work be trained in, can AI platforms be trained on copyrighted materials? Now, here, ASMP has a very unequivocal answer, and that answer is no. We do not support the idea that works that are copyrighted works can be used without a license, without permission, to train AI platforms under whether it's fair use, a fair use analysis or any other analysis, because many photographers can and do have licenses that they will grant to have their work be used in AI training databases. And that is a reasonable thing to do. And so we continue to fight on the side of copyright holders whose work has been ingested into AI platforms for training purposes, and argue against the idea that just because a work is on the internet, it becomes fair game to train AI models. That is something that is fairly unequivocal. The harder questions come in on the other side, on the generative AI output side. And there are some questions, again, that are legal in nature, such as, is a work from a generative AI platform entitled to copyright protection? Now, the Copyright Office has, in the last few months, come out with some statements of their own. And essentially, the Copyright Office has said, no, if a work is solely based on a generative AI platform and does not have substantial human involvement in its creation, it is not subject, or it does not have the opportunity to have copyright protection, certainly as we know it today. And they revised their guidance for people who register for copyrights. And now, if you register for a copyright and you utilize generative AI technologies in what you've created, what you're registering, you have to disclose and disclaim the parts of the image that were created using generative AI technologies without substantial human involvement. Now, there is a lot of trouble with this. And that trouble is goes from everything with how these things have to be disclaimed, the form you get to use, because the form they're asking you to use is the standard application, not the 750 image group application that we're all used to, and a number of other major issues with the registration. So let me be the first to announce that next week, the Copyright Office is going to be doing a webinar with Rob Kasunik, who's the head of registration for the Copyright Office, where they're going to be talking about AI and registration. I will be doing a live stream of that with Matt Gronkut of Petapixel, and the two of us will be discussing beforehand what we expect to hear from the Copyright Office, and we're going to listen to the Copyright Office's webinar, and then we're going to come back on the back end and discuss what we heard and how it changes the game. This is important stuff if you are utilizing any kind of AI-based work in your business or in your photography, because we want you to register those copyrights, and we need to make sure that everyone understands how to do it when AI is involved. So there are a number of questions that are still unanswered, out there. And I know, and I didn't necessarily prep Sean for this, but Sean and I are on many of these AI calls every week. Sean, just in general, based on what I've been talking about and what you've been hearing from photographers, do you have any comments on where you see some of this AI concern going in the next few months?
It's, I mean, I think there's sort of a widespread sort of confusion, kind of being overwhelmed in many ways and not knowing, it's kind of being the forefront of a big technological change. You don't know whether to grab it by the tail and fully invest or fight like hell to kind of hang on to the changes. And I think for a lot of folks, the whole notion of, especially the chat GPT type stuff is really hard to get your head around. And I think, as we slowly kind of distill things and kind of get a broader consensus of where we as a community of creators want to be, it'll help us psychologically, at least me at least, kind of understand this. Because it really, in so many ways, it cuts both ways. It can cut against us in certain ways, and it can cut for us if we learn how to use certain things. And the challenge is going to be to figure out, how it fits in what we do and what our workflow is, and then and then how to adapt to what are going to be increasing sort of checks, I think, on the veracity and the truthfulness of certain images. I think that's certainly going to be the case for editorial photographers, absolutely for news photographers, but anybody who does, natural history, anything where, the veracity of things needs to be declared up front. And I think one of the, you mentioned it, Tom, but one of the issues that's going to be important for many is how to label the images we send to our clients. And then, we hope that they are, when they display them or use them, that our, truthfulness doesn't get blurred, or, that it's clear we've done at least our job in trying to ensure that our clients or the end users, either way, understand, what kind of statements we'd like to make on that front. For a lot of folks, it doesn't matter, for a lot of, commercial photographers and stuff, that's not really an issue. But for many, it's going to be. And I think, I know that there is a lot of scrambling to try to figure out how to, for example, in our IPTC metadata, what is the standardized ways to let people know. And I think that that's evolving pretty rapidly, but AI is such a complicated topic, and it's going to take a lot of a while for that to shake out and for us to kind of standardize on how we communicate those things, I think. Tom, I don't know if you're involved in those conversations. I've followed them
Yeah.
some on that end, but
Yeah,
it still seems uncertain.
No, you bring up some really good points, and I will tell you that ASMP is involved in many different of these coalitions of groups that are wrestling with some of these questions. You know, some of them are based on this idea of how are things labeled. And there's kind of a continuum. On one side of the continuum is and this is going to sound crazy, but I think you're going to hear more of this as we move forward. Human created works, fully human created works, and on the other side are fully AI generative created works, and then there's areas in the middle. And it's almost like, you know, I was thinking the other day, it's almost like we go to the grocery store and we may choose to pay slightly more for a banana that has an organic sticker on it, you know, because we believe in that for whatever reason. You know, I think what you may find is that images will be labeled in different ways, and the marketplace is going to have to wrestle with the value there. It is ASMP's position that that the work, the human ingenuity, the creativity, what photographers bring to the table is paramount, and we are going to continue to fight for a situation in which photographers' voices and creators' voices continue to be heard, and human created works continue to thrive. But I think you're going to start hearing a lot more of these phrases like human created works, you know, and that's a little bit of a shift. It's a shift in the last few months. Now, some of you all might be here. I know because I've gotten some emails. Some of y'all may be, you might have been watching every AI video, and you are expert at AI related things. Some of y'all may have never seen what we're talking about. And so a few weeks ago, Adobe released a beta version of Photoshop. And in that beta version, they have a feature called Generative Fill. And I think that this was another pivotal moment in the development of AI, generative AI technologies as it relates to photographers, because many photographers utilize Adobe software and platforms. And so while we looked earlier at the fact that Adobe has a fully generative AI platform called Adobe Firefly, they've taken that same technology and they've used it as part of Photoshop. And now, again, I will say that I am no longer a working photographer, but I'm going to pull up my version of Adobe Photoshop Beta with a very closely cropped, beautiful little guy there. And I'm going to show you what we're talking about. And so this is the entire image. This was taken in 2007. So obviously there are no pixels on the outside that are staying hidden. And I'm just going to do a few things here, and this is all in real time. So I'm going to crop the image, and let me actually do this here. And I'm just going to make it bigger on either side, you know, because you can see those horns are kind of cut off. And you know, I'll just stick it right about there. And so all I've done is added some extra space around the edges. I'm going to take the rectangular marquee tool. And again, you all who do this every day may have far better ways to do this than I do. And I'm going to invert my selection. And so now I've selected all the white space and just the barest edge of the original image. Again, an image that I even think this might have been taken on slide film. I'm not entirely sure. But down here at the bottom, you see this button that says Generative Fill. And so all I'm going to do is click the Generative Fill button. Now, it gives me a text box where I can type in what I want to see back there, but I'm not even going to mess with that. I'm just going to say generate. And it's going to take a few seconds here, and it's literally just a few seconds. And this vertical image, let's say my client needed to have a horizontal image for something they did, and there it is. And so we can look at, here's the original image. This is what the picture in camera, and here's what it created. And you can choose 3 different versions of it that are all slightly different. Now, this one literally is just one that I grabbed 10 minutes before this situation. But notice how in version 3, it adds the full horn on the left-hand side. In version 2, it kind of gives you a stubby horn, and then there's a different version here. The background's slightly different. And that just took a few seconds. And so how many times did this happen to you where you are a photographer and you have a vertical image and your client asks you for a horizontal image, and you have to do some unique cropping or creative work to get there. And now you can generate, in seconds. You can add a prompt, you can put in language, you can say, I want to see mountains back there. Again, I am no expert at this. That is a 10-second demo, but it's one that I think is representative of both how you can use this in your practice, in your photography, by being able to give your client deliverables that you might not have been able to before, but also how ubiquitous this is going to become, how quick and easy it is to create things. If you want to see some real photographers doing this, go watch that Ohio Valley video I referenced earlier, or just go to YouTube and type in generative fill demos, and you will see thousands of them that will blow your mind. I think this is an important thing that we all understand exists right now in the world. That exists. And so if you have a client who is tech savvy, who uses Photoshop themselves, you may start having to field questions about this, about, well, why should I pay for X when I can do this on my own? To that end, ASMP is going to be launching a series of courses this fall that are focused on both negotiation and client communication related to AI. These are going to become critical skills in the months and the years ahead, and something we want our members to be out in front of. So I know we have some questions that are coming in, and we're going to take some time to answer those here in just a few minutes. I want to wrap by talking about a couple things before we jump into questions. One is, we started developing the ASMP awards at the end of last year. And as I mentioned, generative AI was not something that was on my radar. I'll just talk for me, on my radar in a way that it certainly is now. I would say more than half the emails I get every day have something to do with generative AI. And so that brought up a question about how we approach generative AI in the ethical idea of a contest, right? And so I wanted to show you all what we talk about and what our policy is on AI generated images in contests. And I'm going to click over to this. So ASMP wishes to ensure that the creative voice of all photographers is heard and that the value of human authorship is preserved while utilizing the latest technologies. To that end, images that were created using generative AI technologies, either in whole, such as through a platform like Midjourney or DALL-E, or in part, using the generative fill tools and popular imaging editors, must be submitted in their own category, the AI photo illustration category. In addition, all entrants must attest that the work in all other categories was created without using these technologies. At this point, that is the only way we feel it is fair to incorporate a world in which these technologies exist. Certainly, if you have feedback on that, we'd love to hear it. And as you run into new issues, we'd love to hear what they are. You can always reach us at legal@asmp.org. So I mentioned next week the Copyright Office. Let's see here if I can find it really quickly. the Copyright Office webinar on registration in AI, and we'll be doing a live stream of it. Just stay tuned for the details on that. Well, now let's get to some questions. And these are questions you all have submitted throughout the day. Some of them I want to touch on from some previous things, but we'll end on all the AI related questions. And let me say that this is not exhaustive, that we are going to have many other programs that are going to go into details on some of these. And unlike the legal and business issues that we often talk about, there may be some of these AI questions that I am not able to answer, and I will absolutely tell you if that is the case. But what I always do like to say is that if we can't answer it, we will find the answer. Going back to one of the first things we talked about, and that was predatory contracts in the music industry. One of our attendees noted sometimes a contract is presented to you when a freelance photographer is credentialed to photograph a concert with a top celebrity, and the contract is given to you minutes before. If you don't sign it, you don't get access. How should the photographer react? And then in a parenthetical, the photographer said, in that case, I crossed out the egregious phrases and added my initials, and it went unnoticed. Well, that is a great solution, right? Because remember, a contract, if you cross out a key term or phrase and you put your initials next to that cross out, and the other person signs it and everyone has signed it and no one says anything about it, it's assumed that the revisions that you made, that you initialed, are accepted by the other side. Now, that is, I will say, a lucky endeavor. Probably 9 times out of 10, whoever you hand it back to is going to see that, and they're going to say, no revisions to this. You either sign it as is or you go. And then you have a choice to either sign it as is or go. If you're in a situation where it's being presented to you at the very last minute, a lot of times, you have to make a business decision. Photographers, and I say this when we talk about work for hire, I say this when we talk about copyright transfer, photographers need to be in business, right? And so, I understand if you have to sign a contract that essentially is sprung on you at the last minute, but it's a good platform to talk about how you interact with your clients before the day of, because you want to hammer out as much of this as possible before. Now, in the case that I was mentioning with Brian, who brought the predatory music contracts to us previously, he's negotiating months in advance with some of the largest festivals in the country and saying, hey, this isn't right. That's allowed him to go back and forth with the organizers. And in recent months, he's gotten some good concessions on some of these major issues. We'll be working with Brian to, and some of these companies, in fact, to be developing a new set of model contracts that hopefully the industry will adopt. Now, I will not hold my breath on that, but we are going to do our best to try to do that. I think that's a really good point, though, Karen. Sean, do you ever run into that? Because I know you do a lot of editorial work and magazine and book work where you get a call for a job and then they send you a contract, maybe it's the day before and it has something in there that you didn't expect or you're not comfortable with. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, you just have to respectfully raise it and hopefully they can understand. I think oftentimes it's clients who don't really understand what they're asking you to sign. And many just don't, they go, oh, I don't see that as I see your point. I don't need that. And they're happy to adjust it. I find that quite a bit, because a lot of times you just get lawyers, no offense, who just add the most protective kind of language. And I think that's happening, for example, in these photo contests. They're trying to draft these things to just, to give every protection they possibly can. And, they've kind of lost track of what it is they actually need. And I think that happens with a lot of clients. So many times just pointing it out and saying, look, I think what you really need from me is a non-exclusive license or a license an exclusive license for a set term, and that gets you everything you need without you trying to take X, Y, or Z from me, especially my copyright. And so I think kind of being able to educate a client and then work with them backwards to something that meets both of your needs works pretty well for me.
I think that's a really great point. You know, so much of what your job is as a working photographer is client education, right? And you know, there are a subset of attorneys that are very well versed in image rights and intellectual property and copyright, and the average corporate attorney doesn't care. And so they will just write the same thing that they write in every other contract. And it's important for you to point out these things and why it matters. And there's a difference between transferring your copyright or giving a very long-term exclusive license, right? You know, to the end user, to the client, it may functionally be the same for them, but it's a world of difference for you. And so understanding how to explain that effectively, I think, is critical. Karen has a question here. AI is incorporated in apps and even in Photoshop's neural filters. Is there differentiation between that and dedicated AI generative applications like DALL-E? By the way, I understand that Adobe adds that an image is partially or entirely AI generated in the metadata. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, so you've heard me already today make a very clear distinction between generative AI technologies and AI technology in general. And the reason is I'm following the lead of the Copyright Office. Now, the Copyright Office, in their guidance, in their written guidance in the last month, has said that they understand that many features that might be in Photoshop or another image editing platform do have AI underpinnings, but they are drawing a distinction between those features, which some of us have used for years, right? Many of the features in Photoshop have had, quote, AI underpinnings already. But that is distinctly apart from the generative AI technologies, which instead of modifying the pixels that you already have in ways that machine learning might have influenced, are generating new things that have never existed before. And that is where the Copyright Office draws a line. And I think that is an important thing to note a distinction with. You don't have to, even if you know, a filter in Photoshop has AI underpinnings, you don't have to disclaim that or disclose that on a copyright application according to the Copyright Office. You do have to disclaim or disclose works that are created with purely generative AI features. And as the Copyright Office has said, without that substantial human involvement, it won't issue a copyright registration. Or if it has issued one, there's a chance that it could be invalid. So that is an important question. The second part of your question, I'm going to defer for a few weeks because we've been having a lot of conversations with Adobe. And I think we're close to putting together a program where Adobe may be able to talk about some of the things they've been doing in regard to labeling images, especially through the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is led by Santiago Leon. You can find a panel that Santiago and I did along with Jeff Sedlick at a conference a few months ago, which again feels like a lifetime when we're talking about generative AI related things. So much has changed in the last few months. So stay tuned on that because I think that's an important piece. So another question here. Helen writes, what can an individual do to protect themselves from having their copyrighted images used to train AI systems? It's a really great question. So there are some websites out there right now, like I think it's haveibeentrained.com, I think is one, or just Google have I been trained AI. And what that does is it checks to see if the image that you upload has appeared in the training databases of popular image generative AI platforms. And I will tell you that if your work has been online for a reasonable period of time, there's a good chance you're going to find that your work has been used to train AI technologies. And so the question, though, is what can you do to protect yourself? And, you know, I will give you, I was having a good conversation with Jeff Sedlick, who we do a lot of work with. And he brought up an interesting point, which is on his website, he has a notice that says all of these images are available for a license for AI training purposes. And you might think, well, if I don't want my images to be trained, why would I write that? You know, when we start talking about the different remedies you have, you know, and the different rationale the AI companies have for being able to take images, one of their rationales is that it's a fair use, right? And without getting deep into fair use analysis, there's these 4 elements of fair use and, you know, 4 factors. The 4th factor has to do with the effect on the market. And Jeff makes a good argument, and it's one that I've looked into in recent weeks and somewhat agree with, and that is by offering a license for your works to be used in a generative AI platform, essentially what you're saying is these works are not available for that purpose for free. You can buy it here and do it properly if you want to do it this way. And then no one could argue that you were unaware or you were okay with it or it didn't affect your market because you offer that as a license. I think that's a smart idea. There are flags that different groups are working on that you can put in metadata to say you do not want this work to be trained, to be available for training purposes for AI. There are different platforms out there. There are certain generative AI platforms that only use works that have been specifically licensed. They don't scrape the web, you know, so those are ones that you might want to support. There are a few things to do, but there's nothing that's foolproof. And I think the truth of the matter is that if your works were online in the last year to 2 years, they've been used in training AI platforms. Now, there are a number of lawsuits right now that are going to decide the future of that. And so what we might see in the next year might be different than what we saw in the previous year. But Stable Diffusion and many of the others did not ask permission before they launched these platforms out into the world, and they were built on trillions of images, right? So many images. And so, you know, the people did not have their permission asked for that. So is there a way to prevent it if it's already happened? Yeah, probably not. But moving forward, what you can do is utilize the new technologies that are coming out, flag in your metadata that these images are not available for training AI platforms. And then also, to that one suggestion, maybe put some information on your website that says you'll be happy to grant a license to a company if they want to license your work for use in a training platform. ASMP will likely come out with some draft language on that, which will appear in the ASMP document library. Stay tuned for that. That's over at the ASMP Academy, and a lot more on that in the future. Okay. Sean, did you? I saw. Did you want to mention? I know Jerry had some thoughts, or I didn't know it said you're going to answer this question live. I didn't know if you had any other
Oh,
comments.
sorry. I may have accidentally clicked on that.
Jerry,
Jerry,
okay.
I think has a lot of experience with lobbying and the machinations of Congress. So I'm going to follow up with him. And I think, you know, again, that's another thing where if folks have particular experience in sort of advocacy type issues, whether it's, you know, in government or lobbying or anything like that, we want to know about it. And so that's what this is about. I'm going to follow up with Jerry.
Yeah,
see if we can use a little bit of his talent, a little bit of toil.
You know, I had the pleasure of attending the NANPA summit out in Tucson about a month ago, and meeting Jerry and Jim Datry and I, ASMP CEO. got to sit with Jerry and talk about his time in government. And of course, Jim is an experienced Washington person himself, and hearing the stories was just great. And I think we, between Jim and Jerry and Sean and the full, and Mike Clipper and the advocacy teams that ASMP and NANPA have, we're out there working for you, and we're fighting for you. And so we appreciate all the support. I'm going to end today by answering one last question, but also saying, please join us next week at that live stream we're doing with Petapixel on the Copyright Office AI registration issue or webinar. Stay tuned for that. Please enter the ASMP Remembers Images of COVID-19, the COVID-19 Pandemic juried exhibition. Again, that panel of judges is incredible. The prizes are incredible. We want you to be involved. We're going to be featuring the winners there. And as I mentioned, it is a testing ground and a platform for us to find and create model rules for every industry that wants to have a photo contest. We're going to be sending these rules out to anyone who wants them and helping organizations rewrite their rules to more properly reflect the rights of photographers. The question I'm going to end on came in very early on today, and it says, how do you see AI as a source of making money for a photographer? And I think this question is at the core of what we all are going to try to answer in the next year, because there are some creative things that I've already seen, and I'm going to harken back to the video I mentioned of the Ohio Valley chapter, which you can find on ASMP's YouTube page and in the Academy, because there was a photographer there who's a commercial-based photographer, and she was talking about how she uses AI in her workflow. And she said she reaches out to her clients and asks the client what kind of ideas they have for the upcoming shoot. And she puts those ideas into Midjourney, into generative AI platforms to help develop the idea board, to help develop the set of things that then she can come on top as a photographer and bring to life in the studio and enhance and meet the client's needs and expectations. And I think that is at the core of how photographers are going to integrate AI technologies into their businesses and into their photography. That is figuring out how AI becomes a tool for you to help better meet your client's needs, rather than positioning yourself as something separate and apart from AI, so that the client has a binary choice, right? They can either choose AI or they can choose you. I think the forward-thinking mindset of the photographers on the Ohio Valley panel is representative of some of the best ways that I've heard so far to think about how to integrate AI technology. So I encourage you to go and watch that. We have a lot of things planned for the end of the year over at ASMP and at NANPA. Some things, I can talk about. I mentioned the ASMP Awards is going to have multiple other juried exhibitions, contests this year, some of which will be members only, some of which will be open to the public. We got some stuff there that I can't wait to share with you. But I want to leave you with these thoughts. If you are concerned about how AI is going to affect you and your business, and you have ideas that you want us to either talk about or hear, please send those to us. You can always reach us, as I mentioned, legal@asmp.org. That comes to me and goes to Jim, our CEO, as well. And if there are programs that you want to see or people that you think should be involved in the conversation, let us know. Sean and I are going to continue to work both in the courts in the halls of Congress. We're going to meet with all these organizations that we've mentioned. We're going to try to bring you the latest information on all of this through our partners at Petapixel and others. We hope to always have the latest news and info for you. But we are in this with you. And I want you to remember that as you face the advent of AI technologies and how it is going to change your business in one way or another. It probably already has. But since 1944, ASMP has been around to support photographers. We're going to continue to do that in these times as we move forward and find the best ways to incorporate these technologies into what you do. So with that, I'm incredibly appreciative of everyone who attended today and everyone who watched on our live streams. The recording of this will be made available on our YouTube channel and at the ASMP Academy. Please get involved in some of the activities we have going on, and I can't wait to show you what we have coming up this fall. I think you're going to see some things from ASMP and NANPA that you might have never seen before, and I'm looking forward to it. All right, with that, I appreciate it, Sean. Thank you again. And we will see everyone next time. Bye now.